Welcome to Lady Mythos. Tonight we travel to ancient Greece. Imagine this. The rain had not stopped for hours. Water rolled through the cracks of ancient stone roads, while the trees bent and groaned in the wind, like something moving in the dark beside them. Somewhere far down the hill, a dog started barking. Then another answered. Then all at once, silence. At the edge of the road, where three paths split away into the night, small offerings sat abandoned in the mud. Bread, garlic, eggs, little cups of wine already filling with rainwater. Whoever left them there was gone. Nobody stayed at the Crossroads after midnight. Not in ancient Greece. Because the Greeks believed there were places in the world where reality became thin. Places where the boundary between the living and the dead could weaken for just a moment. And Crossroads were among the most dangerous of them all. Travelers spoke about hearing footsteps behind them on empty roads. Others claimed they saw torchlight moving through the hills, with nobody holding the flame. Dogs would suddenly begin crying at the darkness, as if they sensed something humans could not. And sometimes, people heard a woman's voice, not screaming, not threatening, just close enough behind them to make them turn around. The Greeks had a name for the presence believed to wander those roads. Hecate. And even now, thousands of years later, her name still feels dangerous. Mention Hecate anywhere today, and the same images appear almost instantly. Witchcraft, ghosts, moon rituals, curses whispered in the dark. The dead walking beside torchlight. To some Greeks, Hecate was a protector. To others, she was the last thing you wanted following you home after dark. Ancient writers claimed she traveled with restless spirits through the night, while black dogs announced her arrival before she was ever seen. But the strangest part of Hecate's story is this. None of that was how her myth began. Long before she became feared, Hecate was honored openly across the Greek world. People prayed to her for protection. Families trusted her to guard their homes. Mothers called upon her during childbirth. Sailors begged for her blessing before crossing dangerous seas. And somehow, the same goddess connected to ghosts and graveyards was once associated with life itself. That contradiction is where her story becomes impossible to ignore. Because the ancient Greeks feared her like a demon, but Zeus himself trusted her more than almost any god. And Zeus did not trust easily. He overthrew his own father, destroyed the Titans, punished gods and mortals alike. Yet somehow, Hecate emerged from one of the bloodiest wars in Greek mythology, not diminished, but elevated. While other titans were chained beneath the earth, Hecate walked away from the war stronger than before. Why? Why would the king of Olympus show such unusual respect toward a goddess later associated with witchcraft and the dead? And that is where the mystery truly begins. Because the deeper historians dug into Hecate's origins, the stranger she became. Some myths describe her as compassionate, a protector standing at doorways with a torch to guide lost souls home. Others describe her as terrifying beyond words, a shadowy figure wandering with ghosts at the edge of the world. There were people who prayed to Hecate out of devotion, and others who prayed to her simply because they were afraid not to. That alone tells you something unusual about her. Most Greek gods belonged somewhere. Poseidon ruled the sea. Ares ruled war. Hades ruled the underworld. But Hecate never stayed inside one realm for long. She stood at the threshold between things, between life and death, human and divine, fear and protection, the living world and whatever waited beyond it. And the Greeks understood something deeply unsettling about gods like that. The gods who stand between worlds are often the hardest to control. Tonight, we follow Hecate's story all the way back to the beginning, before the witchcraft, before the ghosts, before frightened travelers left offerings at Crossroads in the middle of the night. Back to a forgotten age, before Olympus fully ruled the cosmos. Because Hecate's story did not begin in darkness. It began long before most of the gods of Greece had even taken their thrones, and the deeper we go into her myth, the more one question begins to grow impossible to ignore. Was Hecate truly the terrifying dark goddess history remembers? Or was that only the final mask people placed upon her after they forgot who she originally was? So settle in, dim the lights, and if you enjoy deep mythology stories like this, subscribe and stay a while, because this journey only gets stranger from here. Because somewhere beyond the fires of Olympus, beyond the gates of the underworld, beyond the torchlit roads where the dead were said to wander, a forgotten goddess is still waiting at the crossroads. And the deeper people searched for the truth about Hecate, the more it seemed she had never fully belonged to the world of gods or humans at all. So who was Hecate really? Chapter 1. Before Olympus, there was Hecate. Long before the Olympians ruled the world, before Zeus raised his thunderbolt against the heavens, before Poseidon claimed the seas, or Hades descended beneath the earth, there was darkness. A different kind of ancient darkness. The kind that existed before kingdoms, before temples, before humanity gave names to the stars above them. And somewhere within that older world, Hecate first emerged. That alone made her different from nearly every major god the Greeks would later worship. Because Hecate did not belong to the generation of Olympus. She came from something older, far older. Her bloodline stretched back to the Titans, the ancient beings who ruled the cosmos before Zeus and the Olympians ever existed. These were not simply gods in the way most people imagine them now. The Titans felt larger than that, more primal, closer to the raw forces of creation itself, the seas, the night sky, time, memory, fire. The Greeks believed the Titans were born closer to the beginning of existence, when the universe still felt wild and unfinished. And Hecate was born directly into that ancient world. Her father was Perses, a titan associated with destruction and hidden power. But it was her mother who made Hecate truly unusual. Asteria, the titan goddess of falling stars, prophecies, and the night sky itself. According to the old myths, Asteria carried the mysteries of the heavens with her. She was connected to dreams, omens, and the strange silence of the world after sunset. Some stories say Zeus himself once pursued her across the skies, but Asteria escaped him by transforming herself into a quail and diving into the sea. Even among titans, she belonged to something distant and untouchable. And from that union between Perses and Asteria came Hecate, a child born from darkness and starlight, from hidden power and cosmic mystery. That origin matters more than most people realize, because when ancient Greeks later looked at Hecate, they did not simply see a goddess. They saw someone whose roots reached back beyond Olympus itself, a survivor from an older age. And there are signs that her story may be even older than Greek mythology remembers. Some historians believe Hecate may not have originally come from mainland Greece at all. Her worship appears connected to ancient Caria in Anatolia, in what is now modern-day Turkey. There, before classical Greece fully formed its pantheon, mysterious night goddesses were already being honored with torches, offerings, and sacred rites. That possibility changes everything, because it suggests Hecate may have existed before the Olympian religion fully took shape. Not created by Greece, but absorbed into it. An older goddess carried forward into a newer world. And maybe that explains why she always felt different, why she never fully resembled the other Olympians, why her presence in mythology feels older, heavier, almost foreign compared to the bright, heroic gods most people recognize. But then came the war that changed the universe forever. The Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the Olympians. For 10 brutal years, the cosmos tore itself apart. Mountains collapsed, the seas rose violently against the earth, the sky itself burned with thunder, as Zeus and his siblings fought to overthrow the older gods and seize control of creation. The Greeks imagined it as total catastrophe, an age-ending war between old power and new power. And when it finally ended, Zeus showed very little mercy. Many titans were chained in Tartarus for eternity. Others were cast down, broken, erased from power. Zeus understood something dangerous about the old gods. As long as they existed, they remained a threat. And yet, somehow, Hecate escaped that fate completely. Not imprisoned, not punished, not cast aside. Instead, Zeus did something almost unbelievable. He honored her. Ancient texts claim Zeus allowed Hecate to keep all the power she already possessed before the war. Even more shocking, he expanded her influence rather than limiting it. That detail stunned ancient writers too, because it raised a question nobody could fully answer. Why would Zeus reward a Titan when he destroyed the others? What made Hecate different? Some believed it was because she never fully sided against Olympus. Others thought Zeus recognized something valuable in her power, something ancient even he did not want to erase. Some ancient writers believed the answer was much simpler. Maybe Zeus understood that certain forces in the universe cannot truly be destroyed, only respected. Because Hecate was not merely tied to one kingdom or one element. She belonged to the deeper structure of the world itself. The night sky, the unseen, the threshold between things. Even Zeus may have realized that removing a goddess like Hecate completely could destabilize the order he was trying to build. So while the old world burned around her, Hecate remained standing, watching Olympus rise from the ruins of the Titans. And then came the moment that changed her destiny forever. Zeus, king of the new gods, offered Hecate something no Titan had ever truly received after the war. Not survival, not forgiveness, power. And that was the moment Hecate became something no other deity ever truly managed to be. Chapter 2. The Goddess. Zeus refused to destroy. If you only know Hecate from modern movies, books, or internet mythology discussions, this next part of her story feels almost impossible to believe. Because after the Titan War ended, Hecate did not become feared. She became powerful, openly powerful, respected across the Greek world, and not secretly either. People built shrines to her. Families prayed to her publicly. Offerings were left in her honor long before her name became connected to fear and darkness. That version of Hecate surprises a lot of people today because it completely clashes with the image most audiences know now. The truth is, early Hecate was not originally presented as an evil or sinister goddess at all. In some of the oldest surviving Greek writings, she was treated almost like a divine force of blessing and success. And the clearest example of that appears in one of the most important texts in all of Greek mythology. Hesiod's Theogony. Written around the 8th century BCE, the Theogony helped shape how the ancient Greeks understood the origins of the gods and the structure of the universe itself. And when Hesiod describes Hecate, something unusual happens. He speaks about her with enormous respect. More respect than many Olympian gods receive. That alone is strange. But what comes next is even stranger. According to Hesiod, Zeus granted Hecate authority over the earth, the sea, and the heavens. Think about that for a second. Most Greek gods ruled one domain. Poseidon ruled the sea. Hades ruled the underworld. Ares ruled war. But Hecate's influence stretched across multiple realms at once. That kind of power was extremely rare, especially for a Titan-born deity living under Olympian rule. And Zeus did not merely tolerate her existence, he elevated her. Hesiod repeatedly emphasizes that Zeus honored Hecate willingly and withheld nothing from her. That detail matters because Zeus was obsessed with control. He feared rivals constantly. Many myths revolve around Zeus punishing anyone who threatened his authority, even members of his own family. Yet Hecate somehow escaped all of that suspicion. Why? That question sits quietly underneath almost every part of her mythology. Because the more you study the Greek gods, the more unusual Zeus's treatment of Hecate becomes. Ancient worshippers seemed to understand this too. They did not approach Hecate like a forgotten minor goddess. They approached her like someone deeply connected to power itself. Hesiod claims she could grant victory in battle, help kings rule wisely, bless fishermen with successful catches, guide sailors safely across dangerous waters, protect shepherds and livestock. Even athletes prayed to Hecate before competitions, because victory was believed to fall more easily upon those she favored. This is the version of Hecate most people never hear about. Not the shadowy goddess of later legend, but a goddess tied to fortune, guidance, protection, and human success. And perhaps the most surprising detail of all, women prayed to Hecate during childbirth. The same goddess later feared as a queen of ghosts was once asked to protect newborn children entering the world. That single fact completely changes the atmosphere around her early worship, because it reveals something important. Early Hecate was connected to life just as much as mystery. Families brought offerings to her, hoping for healthy children, stable homes, and protection over daily life. There were households that treated her almost like a guardian, watching over the entrance of the home itself. Nothing about that sounds like the terrifying witch goddess most modern audiences expect. That contradiction may be the single reason Hecate survived so powerfully in mythology. The deeper you look into her myth, the less stable her identity becomes. She keeps changing, depending on the era, depending on who is worshipping her, depending on what people fear, or what they desperately need. But during this earlier period of Greek mythology, Hecate still stood close to Olympus. Not beneath it, not outside it. She stood unusually close to the center of Olympian power. And that relationship may explain why her influence spread so widely. Because once Zeus publicly honored Hecate, ordinary people had reason to trust her too. If the king of the gods respected her, then she must have held extraordinary importance. And for a while, that respect only grew. Across Greece, statues of Hecate began appearing near homes, temples, and public spaces. People offered food, wine, cakes, and incense, hoping to gain her favor. Sailors carried prayers to her onto the sea. Leaders invoked her name alongside other powerful deities. She was not hidden away in darkness. She stood openly inside Greek religious life. That is what makes her transformation later in history so strange. Because somehow, the goddess trusted by Zeus, the goddess associated with blessing, protection, and victory, slowly became linked to fear. And nobody fully knows exactly when the shift began. But over the centuries, something about Hecate started changing in the minds of the Greek people. Her connection to boundaries deepened. Her association with night became stronger. Older fears began attaching themselves to her name. And eventually, the same Greeks who once prayed openly for her blessings began approaching her very differently. Quietly, carefully, at night. Because centuries later, people would leave food for her at Crossroads out of fear. Chapter 3. Why Hecate walked between worlds. There is a reason so many ancient people feared Crossroads after dark. Not just in Greece, almost everywhere. Even today, there is something strangely uncomfortable about standing alone where multiple roads split apart at night. Your mind becomes alert without fully knowing why. Every direction feels uncertain. Every shadow feels closer than it should. The ancient Greeks understood that feeling deeply. To them, crossroads were not ordinary places. They were thresholds. And thresholds were dangerous. Because the Greeks believed the most dangerous place in the world was not the underworld, but the space between places. That idea sat at the center of how they understood Hecate. She was not simply connected to one world. She moved between worlds, between one state and another, one life and another, one choice and another. And the deeper her mythology evolved, the more she became associated with moments of transition. The strange, uncertain spaces where people no longer felt fully safe. Doorways, city gates, road crossings, borders. The edge between wilderness and civilization. The moment between sunset and full darkness. The Greeks had a word for places like this, even if they did not always explain it directly. Liminal. Places where normal rules weakened. And Hecate became the goddess who ruled over them. That may sound abstract now, but to the ancient world, it felt very real. A traveler walking alone at night was vulnerable. A woman giving birth stood between life and death. A sailor caught between shore and storm existed in uncertainty. Even entering a new home or crossing into a foreign land carried spiritual risk. The Greeks believed transitions made people exposed, and Hecate became the deity people associated with those moments. That is why statues of her were often placed near gates, entrances, and roads. Not to terrify people originally, but to guard those dangerous boundaries. In some homes, small images of Hecate stood near the doorway itself as a protective presence. People believed she could watch the threshold and keep harmful forces outside. But over time, something about that role started changing. Because once a goddess becomes connected to thresholds, people eventually begin asking uncomfortable questions. What exactly passes through those thresholds? Who travels between worlds? And what happens if something crosses over that should not? That growing unease slowly changed how people viewed Hecate, especially at Crossroads. Three-way crossroads became particularly associated with her worship. The Greeks considered them spiritually unstable places, where energies, choices, and unseen forces converged together. And eventually, Hecate herself began appearing in art with 3 faces or 3 bodies joined together, one facing each road, watching all directions at once. The image is unsettling even now. A goddess standing at the center point between multiple paths, able to see what approaches from every side. Some ancient statues showed her holding torches. Others carried keys, sometimes daggers, sometimes serpents. But the torches became especially important, because torches were not merely symbols of light. They represented guidance through uncertainty, the ability to move through darkness without becoming lost inside it. And that idea made Hecate feel different from the brighter Olympian gods people usually imagined, sitting safely above the world. Hecate stayed closer to human fear, to the parts of life people struggled to explain. That may be why people became so emotionally attached to her worship over time. Because every human being eventually reaches moments where life stops feeling stable. Moments where the old path disappears, but the new path has not fully appeared yet. And in Greek mythology, those moments belonged to Hecate. There are old accounts describing travelers leaving small offerings for her before long journeys. Some would whisper prayers before crossing isolated roads at night. Others avoided speaking her name entirely after dark. Not because they necessarily believed she was evil, but because people respected powers connected to the unknown. And Hecate increasingly became associated with exactly that feeling. The unknown, standing just beyond the edge of the torchlight. What makes this especially fascinating is that her mythology still had not fully descended into horror yet. Not completely. At this stage, Hecate still existed in a strange middle ground. People trusted her the way travelers trust torchlight during a storm. The kind of goddess people trusted cautiously. That uncertainty may have made her more compelling than the Olympians themselves. Because predictable gods stay inside temples. Hecate felt like she could appear anywhere, at any threshold, any doorway, any moment where life suddenly changed direction. And perhaps that is why her image continued evolving into something even stranger. The more she became associated with boundaries, the more she became linked to the boundary every human fears most. The line between life and death. Because eventually, people stopped imagining Hecate merely guiding travelers through the night, and started imagining something else walking beside her in the darkness. And eventually, the dead began following her. Chapter 4. The night Hecate entered the Underworld. The story that changed Hecate forever began in a field of flowers. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, had wandered into a meadow gathering blossoms beneath the open sky. Ancient poets describe it as peaceful at first, bright, warm, safe. The kind of place where nothing terrible is supposed to happen. And then, the earth split open. Without warning, the ground beneath Persephone cracked apart, and the god Hades emerged from the darkness below in his black chariot. Before anyone could stop him, he seized her and dragged her down into the underworld. The fields closed behind them. the world became silent again. But not completely silent, because according to the myth, one sound still echoed through the land after Persephone disappeared. Her scream. And out of every god in Olympus, only Hecate heard the girl screaming. That detail changes everything about how Hecate fits into Greek mythology. Because while other gods remained distant, distracted, or silent, Hecate listened. She heard suffering when nobody else did. Ancient writers describe Hecate standing in darkness, holding twin torches after hearing Persephone cry out across the world. Not knowing exactly what had happened, she began searching. She searched because someone had vanished and nobody else seemed willing to listen. That alone separates her from many Greek gods. Most deities in mythology intervene when their authority is challenged or their pride is wounded. Hecate enters this story because somebody is lost. And somewhere else, Demeter had already begun unraveling. When Persephone vanished, Demeter, goddess of the harvest and mother of the missing girl, descended into grief so deep it began destroying the earth itself. Crops failed, fields died. Hunger spread across the world as Demeter wandered endlessly searching for her daughter. For a moment, the myth stops feeling divine at all. This is no longer a story about cosmic wars or divine politics. It becomes a story about loss. A mother searching for her child. And standing beside that grief was Hecate. The image appears again and again in later retellings. Hecate carrying torches through the night beside Demeter as they search the world together. Two goddesses moving through darkness, looking for a stolen girl. The torches matter here more than ever. Earlier, Hecate's flames represented guidance through uncertainty. Now they illuminate grief itself. They become the only light inside a story collapsing into despair. Eventually, after days of searching, they reach Helios, the sun god who sees everything from the sky above. And Helios reveals the truth. Zeus had allowed the abduction. Hades had taken Persephone into the underworld to become his queen. Imagine that moment. Demeter realizing her daughter was not merely lost, she was trapped beneath the earth in the kingdom of the dead. And Hecate remained there beside her through all of it. That detail became incredibly important to later worshippers, because it transformed Hecate's image completely. She was no longer simply a goddess of thresholds and uncertain spaces. She became a witness to suffering, a companion to grief, someone who walked beside pain instead of turning away from it. That emotional layer stayed attached to Hecate permanently after this myth, especially among women. Because unlike many gods in Greek mythology, Hecate does not dominate this story through force. She does not conquer anything. She does not fight a war. Instead of conquering, Hecate stays beside suffering. And eventually, she descends. When Persephone is finally allowed to return from the underworld for part of the year, Hecate becomes closely associated with her from that moment onward. Some versions of the myth describe Hecate greeting Persephone as she rises from the underworld. Others say she becomes Persephone's attendant and companion permanently. And that detail matters more than it first appears, because Persephone herself had changed. The girl who disappeared into the earth did not fully return as the same person. She had crossed a boundary no living being could cross unchanged. She had seen the underworld, lived beside death, become queen of a place feared by gods and mortals alike. And somehow, Hecate became tied to that transformation. The torch-bearing goddess who could move beside Persephone between worlds, between the living earth above and the kingdom below. That connection pulled Hecate closer to the underworld than ever before. Not as a prisoner, not as a victim, but as someone capable of walking near darkness without being consumed by it. And honestly, this may be the moment where Greek culture truly began seeing Hecate differently. Before this story, she was primarily associated with power, protection, blessings, and thresholds. After Persephone's descent, something changed. Now Hecate carried emotional weight, sorrow, night, loss. The silent understanding shared between people who have suffered and survived. And over time, those associations grew deeper and darker. Because once a goddess becomes linked to the underworld, people begin imagining what else she might encounter there, what she might witness in the shadows beneath the earth, what might begin following her back upward when she returns. But perhaps the saddest part of this story is what it reveals about Hecate herself. She exists beside tragedy without ever fully escaping it, always near the doorway, never entirely inside one world or another. Not fully of Olympus, not fully of the underworld, standing between grief and guidance, darkness and light, the living and the dead. And after that journey, Hecate never fully belonged to the world of the living again. Chapter 5. The Goddess of Ghosts and Forgotten Souls. By this point in Greek mythology, Hecate no longer felt like a goddess safely connected to Olympus. Her name had drifted somewhere colder, closer to the edges of human fear. And nowhere was that fear stronger than in the ancient graveyards outside Greek cities. The Greeks did not place their cemeteries at the center of daily life. Graves were usually kept beyond the city walls, separated from the living world. At night, those places became deeply unsettling to people. Silence covered the tombs. Wind moved through broken stone markers. Oil lamps flickered beside burial sites long after families had gone home. And many Greeks believed the dead were not always sleeping quietly beneath the earth. Some spirits wandered, especially at night. This is where Hecate's mythology descends fully into darker territory. Over generations, her name drifted closer and closer toward the restless dead. Not simply death. That distinction matters. Hades ruled the dead as a king rules a kingdom. But Hecate became connected to the things that moved outside proper order. Spirits that lingered too long. Souls trapped between worlds. Ghosts that still walked near the living. The deeper this belief spread, the more unsettling her reputation became. Ancient writers began describing Hecate traveling through the night, accompanied by wandering spirits. Some imagined processions of dead souls moving behind her through empty roads beneath the moonlight. Others claimed black dogs could sense her arrival before humans could. That detail appears again and again across her mythology. Dogs barking suddenly at darkness, dogs whining at empty roads, dogs refusing to move forward as if something invisible stood ahead. To the Greeks, animals often sensed the supernatural before people did, and dogs became one of Hecate's strongest symbols because they were believed to recognize her presence immediately. Even centuries later, stories survived of people hearing dogs howl at Crossroads, moments before strange things occurred. This is the point where Hecate starts feeling less like a goddess and more like a presence. She begins feeling more like a force people encounter. A presence moving through the edges of the world after dark. The atmosphere around her worship changed too. People still prayed to Hecate, but the tone became more cautious, more secretive. Offerings increasingly happened at night instead of daylight. Rituals moved closer to boundaries, tombs, and isolated places. And eventually, Hecate's name became tied to one of the most feared practices in the ancient world: necromancy, communication with the dead. The Greeks were deeply fascinated by the idea that the dead might possess hidden knowledge. Some believed spirits could reveal the future, expose secrets, or carry messages from beyond the grave. But contacting them was dangerous. Very dangerous. Because once the boundary between worlds opened, nobody knew for certain what might answer from the other side. And Hecate became one of the central deities invoked during these rituals. Ancient curse tablets and magical texts began mentioning her name alongside invocations to underworld powers. Some rituals called upon Hecate to guide spirits upward from beneath the earth. Others begged her for protection while communicating with forces beyond human control. This was no longer the bright goddess, honored openly by sailors and kings generations earlier. Her mythology no longer lived near temples and daylight. Closer to the idea that some doors should remain closed. And with that darker reputation came darker companions. One of the strangest beings linked to Hecate was Empusa, a terrifying night spirit described in later Greek folklore. Some stories portrayed Empusa as a shape-shifting female creature with burning hair and bronze legs, who wandered roads at night, hunting travelers. Other myths claimed she served Hecate directly. Ancient people genuinely feared creatures like this, not as entertainment, as real dangers hiding in darkness. The fact that Hecate became associated with beings like Empusa reveals just how far her image had evolved over time. The goddess once trusted to guard doorways was now linked to whatever waited outside them in the dark. And yet, even here, her role remains strangely unclear. Because mythology never fully answers one important question. Was Hecate controlling these spirits, or merely walking among them? That uncertainty made her more frightening than a simple villain ever could be. If she ruled ghosts, then she possessed terrifying authority. But if even she simply moved beside them through darkness, then perhaps the night contained powers beyond anybody's control. That ambiguity stayed attached to her worship permanently. Some ancient Greeks feared her, others respected her. Many likely felt both emotions at the same time. Because Hecate increasingly represented something uncomfortable people sensed deep down, but rarely spoke aloud. The dead were never as far away as they wanted to believe. Every graveyard sat beside the living world. Every city existed beside tombs. Every road eventually led toward death. And somewhere in Greek imagination, Hecate walked near that boundary, carrying her torches through the dark. Not fully human, not fully divine, not fully belonging to the living world anymore. And as centuries passed, her mythology descended even deeper into forbidden territory. Because eventually, people stopped calling upon Hecate only for protection from spirits, and started calling upon her for power. And then, the witches began calling her name. Chapter 6. How Hecate became the goddess of witchcraft. By now, Hecate's name had already become linked to darkness, spirits, and the uneasy boundary between worlds. But this is the chapter where her mythology transforms completely. Because this is where Hecate becomes something far more dangerous in the imagination of the ancient world. A goddess of witchcraft. And strangely enough, that transformation did not happen all at once. It happened slowly, over centuries. It happened so gradually that people likely never noticed the transformation happening. Because the truth is, Hecate was not originally born as the goddess of witches. People turned her into one. And the deeper you look into ancient history, the clearer that transformation becomes. As Greek society evolved, magic itself started becoming viewed differently. Public religion belonged to temples, priests, sacrifices, and official rituals approved by the state. But private magic existed in the shadows. Hidden rituals, secret prayers, spells whispered at night. People seeking control over love, revenge, sickness, fate, or death. Before long, her name started appearing anywhere people feared hidden power. Partly because she already ruled boundaries and unseen spaces. Partly because she was connected to the night. And partly because people increasingly believed she could move between worlds other gods avoided entirely. Once that belief took hold, her name spread through the hidden side of Greek spiritual life. And this is where two of mythology's most famous women enter the story, Medea and Circe. Even now, thousands of years later, both names still carry the same feeling around them. Dangerous intelligence, forbidden knowledge, power people fear. Circe, the enchantress from the Odyssey, lived isolated on her island, surrounded by wild animals and strange potions. Ancient stories describe her mixing herbs, speaking incantations, and transforming men into beasts. Medea was even more feared. A sorceress connected to powerful magic, poisons, and revenge so brutal that ancient audiences considered her terrifying. And both women became deeply associated with Hecate. In some myths, Medea is described as a priestess of Hecate herself. Other stories claim Hecate taught her the secrets of magic directly. That connection mattered enormously because Medea was not portrayed as a harmless healer. She represented the fear of knowledge without limits, especially knowledge held by women. And that fear slowly reshaped Hecate's identity too. The more society feared powerful women, the darker Hecate became. That shift is one of the most fascinating parts of her mythology. Because if you go back far enough, Hecate was connected to blessing, protection, childbirth, and guidance. It is hard to ignore the contradiction. The same goddess, once trusted with childbirth, was now feared for speaking with the dead. But as magic became viewed with greater suspicion, the goddess associated with hidden knowledge transformed alongside it. She became the patroness of what society feared, but could never fully erase. The deeper society distrusted hidden knowledge, the more Hecate absorbed that fear. Ancient magical traditions began invoking Hecate constantly. Her name appears across surviving curse tablets buried beneath graves, wells, and crossroads. People scratched desperate requests into lead tablets, asking for protection, revenge, love, victory, or punishment against enemies. Some prayers begged Hecate to bind lovers together. Others asked her to destroy rivals. There were spells calling upon her beneath the moonlight, while incense and herbs burned in bronze bowls. And unlike the clean public worship of Olympus, these rituals often happened far from temples. In forests, cemeteries, ruins, isolated places beyond the safety of ordinary society. The atmosphere surrounding Hecate changed again. Now she no longer felt merely mysterious. She felt forbidden. One surviving collection of ancient magical texts reveals just how deeply this transformation went. The Greek magical papyri. These texts, gathered across Egypt and the Greek world during later antiquity, contain rituals, invocations, spells, and mystical instructions involving dozens of gods and supernatural beings. And Hecate appears constantly. Sometimes she is called upon beside underworld powers. Other times she is invoked using long, secret names believed to contain hidden power. Certain rituals describe torches, black dogs, keys, moonlight, and offerings left during specific phases of the moon. Some instructions sound almost hypnotic. Whispered chants, repeated in darkness, while the practitioner attempts to contact unseen forces. And the more Hecate became tied to these practices, the more terrifying her reputation grew among ordinary people. Because public religion and private magic were not viewed the same way. One represented order, the other represented dangerous possibility. And Hecate increasingly belonged to the second world. The Romans pushed this transformation even further. As Greek mythology blended into Roman culture, Hecate became heavily associated with nocturnal magic, ghosts, and terrifying supernatural rites. Roman poets often described her appearing beneath the moon, with howling dogs and spirits surrounding her. This is where many of the darker images modern audiences recognize truly intensified. Torch-bearing witch goddess, moonlit rituals, forbidden spells, dark crossroads. By the Roman era, Hecate's older identity had almost become buried beneath centuries of fear and supernatural imagery. But traces of the older goddess never disappeared completely. That is what makes her mythology so compelling. Even at her darkest, fragments of the earlier Hecate still remain visible beneath the surface. The protector, the guide, the goddess of thresholds. And perhaps that contradiction is why her story survived for so long. Because Hecate represented something people could never fully decide how to feel about. Fear, respect, fascination, suspicion, all at once. Even now, modern audiences remain obsessed with her for the exact same reason. She embodies forbidden knowledge without becoming entirely evil. She stands outside ordinary structures of power. And unlike many gods in mythology, Hecate changes with the fears of the people worshipping her. The more uncertain society became about hidden knowledge, feminine power, and the unknown, the more dangerous Hecate appeared. And yet people kept calling her name anyway. That alone says something important, because human beings have always been drawn toward mysteries they know they should probably avoid. And Hecate became the face of that temptation itself. The torch in the darkness, the whisper promising hidden knowledge, the presence waiting at the edge of the firelight while ancient rituals unfolded beneath the moon. But strangely enough, the deepest mystery surrounding Hecate had nothing to do with witchcraft at all. Because beneath the spells, the curses, and the fear, there was still one part of her identity people never fully understood. But the strangest part of Hecate's story had nothing to do with magic. Chapter 7: The Three Faces of Hecate. By now, Hecate had become many things at once. A goddess of thresholds, a guide through darkness, a figure tied to spirits, hidden rituals, and forbidden knowledge. But there was one image that captured her mystery more than any other. Three faces staring in different directions at the same time. Travelers arriving at Crossroads by torchlight sometimes found her statues waiting there in silence. Even today, it remains one of the most unsettling images in Greek mythology. A single goddess split into three forms, watching every path at once. Ancient statues of Hecate often showed her standing back to back with herself, each figure facing outward toward a different road. Travelers approaching a crossroads at night might see these stone figures holding torches, keys, or blades beneath flickering firelight. And honestly, the image feels strange even now. Not monstrous exactly. Something more unsettling than that. Like a being that cannot fully exist in one identity. At first, the symbolism was probably practical. Three roads meeting together. Three directions needing protection. A goddess capable of watching all paths at once. But over time, people began attaching deeper meanings to her triple form. And those meanings transformed Hecate into something psychologically powerful. Some later traditions connected her three faces to the moon itself. Waxing, full, waning. Others linked her to three stages of womanhood: the maiden, the mother, the crone. That interpretation became especially influential in modern discussions of Hecate, even though parts of it developed much later than ancient Greece itself. Still, the symbolism survived because it felt emotionally true to people. Hecate represented transformation, change, the different selves a person becomes over the course of life. And maybe that is why her mythology continues affecting people so deeply today. Because beneath all the ancient rituals and supernatural stories, Hecate touches something extremely human. The feeling of becoming someone new while still carrying older versions of yourself inside you. That idea sits quietly underneath her entire myth. Three forms, three identities, three selves existing simultaneously. Not fully separate, not fully united. And once you start looking at Hecate this way, her mythology becomes even more fascinating. She exists between worlds because she herself feels divided between worlds. Part protector, part feared outsider, part divine guide. Even the Greeks seemed uncertain about who she truly was by this stage in her evolution. Different regions described her differently. Different centuries reshaped her again. Some worshippers focused on her wisdom. Others feared her darkness. Some saw her as compassionate. Others viewed her almost like a supernatural threat moving through the night. And somehow, all these versions survived together. That is very unusual in mythology. Most gods become simplified over time. Hecate became more fragmented, more layered, more difficult to define. And maybe the Greeks feared Hecate because she represented something impossible to control. Transformation itself. Because transformation is uncomfortable. People prefer stable things, clear identities, simple definitions. But Hecate refuses simplicity. The closer someone gets to her mythology, the harder she becomes to categorize. Even visually, she keeps changing. One face appears calm and wise, another young and watchful, another severe enough to make people uneasy. Some artistic depictions made one side of her beautiful and another frightening. Almost as if ancient people were trying to express the idea that no one is entirely one thing, that every human being contains contradictions. The Greeks seem to understand something modern psychology later explained clearly. People are never entirely one thing. And Hecate somehow came to embody all of it. This is also why she became such a strong feminine archetype later in history. Not because she represented perfection, but because she represented complexity. Independent female figures in mythology were often simplified into categories people found easier to understand. Mother, wife, daughter, villain. But Hecate never stayed inside one role long enough to become predictable. She moved between identities constantly. And for many later audiences, especially modern ones, that made her feel strangely real. She was not purely nurturing, not purely destructive, not fully accepted by Olympus, not fully rejected either. She existed outside neat structures, and people tend to remember figures like that, especially during uncertain periods of history. There is another reason the image of her triple form became so powerful too. It reflected how ancient people understood time itself. Some traditions linked Hecate's three faces to the past, present, and future. A goddess capable of seeing all directions of time simultaneously. That idea deepened her association with prophecy and hidden knowledge. Because if Hecate stood at the boundary between different states of existence, perhaps she also stood between different moments in time, watching what had been, what was happening now, and what was still approaching from the darkness ahead. That possibility made her feel less like an ordinary deity and more like something ancient moving underneath reality itself. This may be the real reason Hecate survived, while so many gods faded. People do not just remember her because she was associated with magic. They remember her because she represents something psychologically timeless. The fear of change. The fear of becoming someone different. The fear of standing at a crossroads in life without knowing which version of yourself will emerge on the other side. Hecate became the face of that uncertainty, the goddess of thresholds, not only in the world, but inside the human mind itself. And over time, as her mythology continued evolving, something unfortunate happened. The deeper her image moved into darkness and mystery, the more people forgot the older parts of her story. The protector, the guide, the goddess trusted by Zeus himself. Slowly, those memories faded beneath newer fears. And over time, people stopped seeing the protector and only remembered the shadow. Chapter 8. Why Ancient Greece Feared Her. By the time Hecate's mythology reached its later form, fear had become inseparable from her name. Not ordinary fear, not the fear people felt toward monsters in stories. Something quieter, more psychological. The kind of fear that changes behavior. The kind that makes people avoid certain roads after dark, even when they cannot fully explain why. Because in ancient Greece, Hecate stopped feeling like a distant goddess living safely on Olympus. She felt close. Too close. And nowhere was that tension more visible than during the Deipnon rituals. Every month, on the night of the new moon, many Greeks observed what became known as Hecate's Deipnon, a ritual meal offered to the goddess at crossroads and thresholds. At first glance, it sounds simple enough. Food left outside. Bread, fish, eggs, garlic, small cakes. But the atmosphere surrounding the ritual made it deeply unsettling. These offerings were usually left at night, quietly, often in silence. People placed the food at crossroads or near shrines dedicated to Hecate, and then walked away without looking back. That detail appears again and again in historical accounts. Do not look back. Because many believed Hecate and the spirits accompanying her moved through the night during these rituals, and nobody wanted their attention. Imagine ancient streets after midnight, no city lights, no noise except wind moving through narrow stone alleys. A hooded figure carrying food toward a crossroads while dogs bark somewhere in the distance. A torch flickering in the dark, then suddenly extinguished by the wind. That imagery became attached permanently to Hecate's worship. Not because every worshipper believed she was evil, but because people feared offending powers they did not understand. The Deipnon rituals served another purpose too. They were acts of purification. People believed spiritual pollution accumulated over time inside homes and communities. By offering food to Hecate at the end of the lunar month, they symbolically pushed misfortune, sickness, and harmful forces away from the household. That tells us something important. Even during periods when Hecate was feared most intensely, people still viewed her as powerful enough to protect them. Fear and dependence existed together. And honestly, that combination made her even more intimidating. Because there is something deeply unsettling about needing the favor of a deity you are also afraid of. Nobody wanted to meet Hecate after midnight. But many still hoped she would remain on their side. The fear surrounding nighttime itself also intensified her reputation. The Greeks associated darkness with vulnerability. Once the sun disappeared, familiar spaces became uncertain. Roads looked different. Sounds carried farther. The imagination became more active. And Hecate increasingly became linked to everything people feared might emerge after sunset. Strange noises, unseen movement, sudden madness, bad omens. Ancient writers began associating her with curses and psychological torment as well. Certain texts describe people invoking Hecate during revenge rituals meant to bring confusion, nightmares, or suffering upon enemies. Even madness itself became connected to supernatural forces in ancient thought. A person behaving irrationally might be viewed as spiritually afflicted or influenced by hostile powers moving through the unseen world. And once again, Hecate's name appeared near those fears. Not always as the direct cause, sometimes as the force controlling or restraining them. But by now, ordinary people likely no longer cared about those distinctions very much. Her reputation had already darkened beyond repair. Roman writers intensified this image even further. This is where Hecate's mythology begins feeling almost Gothic in tone. Roman poets described terrifying nighttime ceremonies dedicated to her beneath black skies and moonlight. They imagined ghostly processions, barking dogs, witches chanting in hidden places, and crossroads haunted by supernatural forces. Some stories portrayed her appearing with snakes wrapped around her body or carrying flaming torches while spirits gathered around her in the dark. The Romans loved dramatic supernatural imagery, and Hecate became one of the main figures through which they expressed fears surrounding magic, death, and the unknown. By this stage, her older identity as protector and guide had become buried beneath centuries of escalating superstition. But the fear surrounding Hecate reveals something important about ancient society itself. Some people, reportedly, left the offerings and hurried home without speaking to anyone. Others avoided even glancing toward the crossroads once the food touched the ground. In certain regions, poor families sometimes took the abandoned food afterward, which created another unsettling belief: that anyone eating Hecate's meal might unknowingly consume something meant for the dead. Darkness, death, transformation, the future, hidden knowledge, mental instability, the unknown spaces between one stage of life and another. That is why she survived so powerfully inside cultural memory, because she embodied uncertainty itself. And uncertainty frightens people more than almost anything else. Fear only made the rituals more private. If anything, it strengthened it. Because when societies become anxious, people often turn toward figures associated with hidden protection, especially figures believed to understand darkness better than anyone else. So while Hecate became more feared publicly, her worship continued quietly, in private, behind closed doors, at isolated shrines, at moonlit crossroads, in whispered prayers spoken carefully into the night. And despite everything people claimed to fear about her, despite the curses, the omens, the ghost stories, and the midnight rituals, thousands still reached for her name when they felt powerless. Yet thousands still prayed to her in secret. Chapter 9. The Hidden Meaning of Hecate. For thousands of years, Hecate should have disappeared. Many ancient gods did. Their temples collapsed, their names faded. Their stories survived only in fragments, buried beneath ruins and forgotten texts. But Hecate never vanished completely. In fact, in some ways, she feels more relevant now than she did centuries ago. And that raises an important question. Why? Why are modern audiences still fascinated by a goddess connected to darkness, crossroads, witchcraft, and the unknown? Part of the answer is obvious. Hecate has mystery around her. People are naturally drawn toward figures that feel forbidden or misunderstood. But the deeper reason goes much further than mythology. Because somewhere along the way, Hecate stopped being only a goddess from ancient Greece. She became a symbol. And symbols survive longer than empires, especially symbols connected to transformation. When people talk about Hecate today, they are often talking about something deeply personal without even realizing it. Independence, reinvention, intuition, the hidden parts of the self people spend most of their lives trying to ignore. That is why her mythology still resonates so strongly in the modern world. Because Hecate represents transition itself, and every human being eventually reaches moments where transition becomes unavoidable. A relationship ends, a career collapses, a version of your identity no longer fits who you are becoming. Life changes direction suddenly, and you realize there is no path backward anymore. And in those moments, people often feel exactly the same way ancient crossroads were meant to feel. Uncertain, uncomfortable, halfway between one life and another. That is why Hecate survives psychologically. She became the archetype of standing in the middle of transformation without fully knowing what waits on the other side. Every person eventually reaches a crossroads where an old version of themselves has to die. That idea sits at the center of her mythology, whether people realize it or not. And maybe that is why modern audiences connect with her so emotionally. Because unlike gods associated purely with strength or perfection, Hecate feels connected to difficult transitions people genuinely experience. Hecate feels connected to the periods of life people usually hide from everyone else. The parts of life that rarely feel clean or simple. This is also why she became such an important figure in modern witchcraft movements and spiritual practices. Not simply because people viewed her as magical, but because she represented hidden knowledge and personal transformation outside traditional systems of authority, especially for women. Throughout history, powerful independent women were often treated with suspicion. Women who lived outside accepted social roles, healers, mystics, midwives, spiritual practitioners, were frequently feared or misunderstood. Hecate gradually became associated with all of them, and over time, she evolved into something larger than mythology itself. A symbol of feminine autonomy, a version of femininity that refused to stay easily defined. The kind society often struggles to categorize comfortably. That is one reason the later maiden, mother, crone interpretation became so influential in modern spirituality, even though it developed long after ancient Greece. Because people saw themselves reflected in it. The different identities a person moves through during life. The different selves carried within one individual. And once again, Hecate became associated with transformation rather than stability. Psychologists and modern thinkers have explored this side of her mythology too. Some interpret Hecate as a symbol of what Carl Jung called the shadow self, the hidden parts of personality people suppress, fear, or refuse to acknowledge openly. The anger buried beneath politeness, the instincts hidden beneath social masks, the intuition people ignore because it feels irrational. Hecate became connected to those unseen layers of the human mind because her mythology always existed near the edge of what people were uncomfortable confronting. Death, fear, power, desire, identity, the unknown. And unlike many mythological figures, she never offers easy answers. That is important. Hecate does not represent escaping darkness. She represents learning how to walk through it, not escaping darkness, but learning how to move through it without disappearing inside it. That may be why younger generations continue rediscovering her over and over again online. Across social media, modern occult communities, psychology discussions, mythology channels, and spiritual spaces, Hecate's image keeps returning. Sometimes as a goddess, sometimes as a symbol, sometimes as something people cannot fully explain, but deeply feel drawn toward anyway. And perhaps that is because modern life creates more liminal spaces than ever before. People reinvent themselves constantly now. Careers change, identities shift, communities disappear and reform online. The stable structures older generations relied upon often feel less permanent than they once did. In many ways, modern people live at psychological crossroads all the time. And Hecate has always belonged there. That is why her story feels strangely timeless, despite originating thousands of years ago. Because beneath the mythology, the rituals, the fear, and the magic, Hecate represents one of the oldest human experiences imaginable, standing between who you were and who you are becoming. The ancient Greeks sensed that power long before modern psychology gave it language. That is why they feared her, respected her, and continued whispering her name across centuries, even after empires collapsed around them. Because some archetypes never truly disappear, especially the ones connected to transformation itself. And maybe that's why Hecate never disappeared. Epilogue. The woman still waiting at the crossroads. The rain still falls on the crossroads, cold water sliding across broken stone, wind moving through dark trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog begins barking into the night, and once again, small offerings sit quietly where the three roads meet. Bread, garlic, wine. The same things people left thousands of years ago, when they believed certain places in the world were thinner than others. But now, the story feels different. Because now we understand why Hecate remained there for so long. She was never simply the terrifying witch goddess later generations reduced her into. And she was never entirely the benevolent protector worshipped openly in ancient temples either. She was something far more complicated. A goddess of thresholds, of transition, of becoming. That is why her mythology changed so dramatically across history. Every generation projected its fears onto her. The Greeks feared the unknown spaces between life and death. Later societies feared witchcraft and powerful women. Others feared hidden knowledge, transformation, and the parts of themselves they could not fully control. And somehow, Hecate absorbed all of it. The nurturing guide carrying torches through darkness. The Titan-born survivor older than Olympus itself. The watcher at Crossroads. The companion of Persephone. The goddess connected to spirits and hidden rituals. The feared queen of witchcraft. The protector people trusted, and the presence they feared meeting after dark. All of those versions survived together because Hecate herself represented contradiction. And maybe that is why people still feel drawn toward her now. Because modern life is filled with crossroads too. Moments where identities collapse and new versions of ourselves begin forming. The end of relationships, the loss of certainty, periods of grief, loneliness, transformation, the uncomfortable process of becoming someone different. Hecate survives because she speaks to those moments directly, not with easy comfort, but with recognition. She is the figure standing beside uncertainty itself, holding a torch instead of looking away from the darkness. That is why people exploring shadow work, spirituality, psychology, and personal transformation continue rediscovering her over and over again. Not because they necessarily believe in ancient gods literally walking the earth, but because the symbolism still feels real, especially for women. Hecate became one of the great feminine archetypes precisely because she refused to stay inside roles society found comfortable. She was independent, powerful, unpredictable, connected to intuition and hidden wisdom. And historically, societies have often feared women who cannot be easily controlled or defined. In many ways, Hecate became the mythological reflection of that fear, but also the reflection of something else. Freedom. The freedom to transform, to step outside old identities, to walk through darkness without letting it destroy you. And perhaps that is the final truth hidden inside her mythology. The Greeks did not fear Hecate because she was a monster. They feared her because she stood at the doorway between who they were and who they could become. That is why her story survived, because every human being eventually reaches that doorway. And somewhere deep in cultural memory, Hecate is still standing there, holding the torch, waiting at the threshold between endings and beginnings. And maybe somewhere tonight, at some forgotten crossroads, her torches are still burning. If you want more deep Greek myths like this, subscribe and stay a while. There are many more stories hidden in the dark. Thank you for listening. Yours, Lady Mythos.